climate change is driving Africa's rural populations to the city. The Institute for Security Studies research says that changing weather patterns and environmental shocks have been hampering rural productivity. So people relying on agriculture or its value chain are moving to urban areas to seek alternative livelihoods. For more on the findings, we're now joined by Aimée-Noël Mbiyozo, who's a senior research consultant, migration at the Institute for Security Studies. Aimée, thank you so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks so much for having me again, Peter.
Yeah, so urbanization is not a new phenomena. What is it this time around? What's different with this urbanization that we're seeing that's closely related to climate change?
Yeah, so climate change is definitely having an impact across both rural and urban systems in a multitude of ways. It's almost hard to capture them all. So one of them is it's driving rural to urban movement. And this is in a context where we're already rapidly urbanizing on the continent. So Africa is currently at 43% urban. And that's compared to the European Union at 75% and the US at 80%. So it's really important to note that urbanization in its own right is not a bad thing. So the resources aren't finite. We're not competing over finite resources in the cities. And the interests between rural and urban aren't competing by rule. There's definitely major development potential in grouping people in cities, and per capita GDP globally tends to go up significantly as urban populations grow. So how well we handle it as a continent and as countries really comes down to how it is planned and managed. So broadly speaking, to date, it hasn't reduced poverty on the continent. So 70% of urban populations are currently living in slum conditions. And in addition to all of the other hazards that come with living in slums, they're also environmentally vulnerable areas. So a lot of them occur in floodplains or made of heat absorbing or conducting materials. So there's that. As climate change impacts increase, there's also that factor as well. But overall, if people are leaving rural areas because crops are failing or rains have become too unpredictable, they're likely to be dispossessed, and having large numbers of people flowing from rural poverty to urban poverty in an unplanned and unmanaged fashion really won't have any good outcomes.
So
I think planning is the key.
Yeah, when we talk about planning, so what happens to the rural communities? Because the funding for things like mitigation and adaptation will then generally tend to flow to the areas of greatest need, which then become the urban areas, isn't it?
Well, hopefully not. So certainly both adaptation and mitigation need to be planned across both the rural and the urban spaces, and they need to be done with equal urgency. So I'll just qualify that a little bit by saying that in the climate change space, we speak of mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation being reducing the carbon emissions to slow or to stop the climate change impacts, excuse me, and adaptation is adjusting to reduce the vulnerabilities to the impacts. Importantly, so according to Oxford, Africa has the lowest emissions in the world, so we're only emitting 3.7%. But we bear a disproportionate burden of the adaptation. So not only is the continent warming faster than the average global pace, but it's particularly reliant on rain-fed agriculture. So 95% of the food grown is rain-fed, and agriculture employs 65% of the labor force and comprises 32% of the GDP across the continent. So we also have the least resources available to do the adaptation. So we don't have, we need, it costs infrastructure and money and planning and governance. These all play a really important role in how well a region, whether it's a city or a rural area, are going to adapt. So I think, mitigation is certainly a really important factor, especially in South Africa, where we are the 12th highest emitter on the planet. But adaptation really, one thing that we advocate strongly for is that adaptation really needs to be prioritized on the continent, because it's a problem that we haven't created, but that we're going to bear the burden in adapting to. And that hasn't been the case historically. And that, as I've said, needs to take place over both rural and urban spaces.
And the continent has experienced the fastest rate of urbanization. Has that been accelerated with climate change issues? And if so, I mean, can we even cope? Because our economies are moving slow, I guess not at the same speed. So we're just getting a compounding of problems, aren't we? Congestion and all the issues that are associated with it.
Yeah, definitely. But like I said from the start, urbanization in and of itself isn't the problem. So there's definitely ways. There's, cities have capabilities to establish, to be planned appropriately and to be planned in a green way, so that we aren't competing for finite resources. They are congested, but there are, ways to plan around it. And I think that's the important part, is that we really need to start moving forward on some of that planning, because it is a bit difficult to isolate exactly who is moving into cities because of rural decline or because of climate change factors. But unless we do something about it, then it is going to be unmanaged flow, and that has really dire consequences.
What do good, typical climate change related urbanization models look like? What sort of things will cities and authorities be doing when they're taking into consideration climate linked migration?
I think that question is actually probably better left in the hands of a city planner.
Yeah.
So I'm actually not an urban planner, but one thing that we did find in an Institute for Security Studies research report recently is that across South Africa, which is having major urbanization from both within the country and from neighboring countries, is that none of our existing climate change frameworks and policies speak to this factor. So none of them address the fact that it's going to drive urbanization. And we haven't yet, as a country, enacted the Climate Change Act. And one thing that would do is it would force municipalities and smaller regions to include this kind of planning in their to include climate change planning and urbanization within their city plans. So that's what we really strongly advocate for. Right now, urbanization and climate change are very separate. The city planners are working really hard, and they're one of the key drivers of this stuff. So they've got great ideas on how to make a city green and adaptable. But right now, the national level frameworks for climate change and the city planners, they're not working together. And that's something that we're calling for urgently.
So we're talking about urbanization, rural to urban. I wonder if this isn't being trans-border as well. People from other countries now moving as a result of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. So South Africa is already very much a hub of migration from neighboring countries. And most of the people, the bulk of those are people who are coming in seeking work already. There are no legal pathways for people who fit in that category. So sort of low skilled people looking for income earning activities. There's no legal, as we call legal pathways for them to come in the country. So they're already coming and staying irregularly and are already in fragile situations when it comes to xenophobia. They don't have access to services. A lot of them are exposed to crime for sort of, the first time. But definitely, climate change impacts are certainly escalating throughout the region and will be driving more population towards urbanization. And again, that's something that we don't currently account for in urbanization models or in our climate change frameworks, is how this is going to affect movement. It won't just increase movement, it will impact how people are moving and who is moving.
Is food security something that we should be worried about? Because if people are leaving the rural areas, that might imply that agricultural output, productivity will be affected.
Yeah, definitely. So we're already seeing food price increases. I said earlier that continentally we're 95% dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and agriculture makes up about 2/3 of the continental workforce. So certainly we've already seen food prices increase in some instances. And we refer to slow onset. We refer to sudden and slow onset impacts of climate change. And sudden impacts are large events like hurricanes and storms and floods, et cetera. But the slow onset is already, that's droughts and desertification and salinization, those types of impacts. So we've already seen in the country that hot and cold extremes have increased, that rainfall seasonality has changed, and intensity of rainfall has increased. Heat waves have increased majorly across South Africa alone. So these are decreasing crop yields. There are livestock losses. Increased carbon also impacts the feed quality for livestock. So, and also vector-borne diseases. So water and vector-borne diseases go up through these impacts. All of that certainly impacts food prices and food availability. And there are definitely parts of the continent, not so much South Africa yet, where it has taken a strong impact. It's had a very strong impact on food security. We saw last year the locust infestation. So there were swarms of locusts that were the size of cities, and that's had a major impact on food availability across East Africa.
Perhaps finally, Aimée, we're days away from COP26. What would be big wins for Africa at COP26?
Well, I think you really want to see the high-income countries live up to their commitments. So they have previously committed $100 billion US per year towards climate financing, and they have fallen short. And I think you can see in some of the narratives leading up to the meeting that this is going to be a major focus, is that, as we've already said in this interview, this is not a problem that Africa has created, but it's one that we're going to have to bear the burden of. So making sure that the people who made the mess are going to play a key role in cleaning it up, as we say. And yeah, so that's probably the key thing that comes away. But I think and pushing the adaptation factor, I think, is also really important. So whether the funding is available, I see as a quantity issue, but we also have a quality issue. So, adaptation financing adaptation planning is still fairly new. And as it happens, only 3% of the projects that have taken place so far are even at a stage where we can tell if they're working. Are they making communities more resilient? And that has to be the end goal, is that we need to be making communities more resilient to these impacts. The best solutions are going to be driven from within a community, because each community has individual needs when it comes to this. So taking that funding, securing the funding, and ensuring that it's actually making communities resilient is going to require quality projects that are ready to be scaled up immediately. And I argue that that's definitely a key focus that we need to have on the continent.